Hi, everyone. Welcome to the March Coffee and CEU's event for the DBA SIG. Thank you so much for coming on and attending today's talk. We have a really fun conversation today with Denisha Gingles, and she's going to talk about Justice Act and ABA committing to a better world. Very exciting stuff. So before we start, just a quick refresher. If you are new to Coffee and CEUs, this is a free events that we put on by the DBA for our members. It's only $10 to sign up for a Coffee and CEU event if you're a non-member. But if you do want to become a member, for $20 a year, you get access to 12 months worth of CEs, which is pretty awesome since we do these once a month. We talk about a wide range of things. Things concerning dissemination and ACT. We also talk about social justice as well and policy change. If you want to check out that talk, let me know, DBA members, because it is on our members page. And I believe next month we're going to have the wonderful Whitney Hamill from Autism Compassion Africa. Come on, she is our 2019-2020 dissemination grant winner. So it's very exciting that she's going to be coming on and talking to our membership. Tickets for that should be coming on sale shortly. We have it planned for mid-April. And I believe, and yes, we have our town hall meeting that's coming up. We should be posting the dates for that very shortly. And without further ado, Denisha, who is so on brand with your coffee. I love it. Please take it away.
Alrighty, well, thank you everyone for having me here this month. I'm really excited about today's talk. Thank you for inviting me, Annie. I will preface today's talk with, I don't know how correct it is for today's talk to be fun, but we will see how it feels for us to get through this together. But yes, I just want to thank you all for joining us this morning. I won't talk too much about myself. So if you want more information about me, my work, or anything else, you can feel free to email me. Because we aren't here for a long time, so I want to make sure that we're spending our time focused on what matters the most, which is our topic at hand. And so just so you know, this webinar is experiential, so I'm going to be talking a lot, but there are times that I'm going to ask for you to also participate. You can do this privately or overtly by talking to me inside of the chat box, okay? So to get us started, I prepared a few questions. And I'm going to ask that you take a moment of true reflection, and you can simply respond your answer privately with a yes or a no answer. There's no one there in your mind, so there's no need to shift your answers. But if you do feel the need to shift away from your immediate response, I would just like for you to recognize that. And I know personally that reflection is oftentimes uneasy. It reveals something about ourselves that maybe we would like to do better, or maybe something that we aren't proud of, but I ask that you're honest with yourself anyway. So as I stated, I'm going to start off by asking you a few questions. So the first one is, I'm aware of my own racial, cultural, and ethnic identities. I have reflected on my own personal biases and prejudices. I have reflected on my privileges and unearned advantages in comparison to other groups of people. My privileges reveal themselves while I'm working with my clients and/or colleagues. Okay, so thank you for taking that moment of reflection. Why am I doing this? Why do I do topics like this? I have a few reasons. The first one, on a smaller but very important scale, I do this in hopes to improve the quality of experiences in the field for marginalized groups, whether they are our clients, future clients, our colleagues, students, supervisees, or research participants, etc. A more overarching goal that I have is that I hope that we can do work together to create more change agents, more accomplices, which are people that are committed to engaging in behaviors that recognize humanity in all humans, and to be the people who show up and champion for historically marginalized groups and their causes. And I hope that we can do this as analysts and also as fellow humans. Okay. So what we're going to do today, we are going to identify ethical and practical issues of diversity and equity within behavior analysis. We're also going to use the 6 core principles of ACT to identify methods that we can use to increase equity and justice in the field and the world. Okay. Alrighty, so oftentimes in our field and in the world, it seems that we handle issues of diversity kind of by using our ABC model, right? We notice that one thing is just like the other. We have this very homogenous group based on some type of formal similarity. And we say, we have to do something about this. What is it? I know what that one thing is. Let's go ahead and bring on someone that makes this group different. And they vary in topography, similarity, characteristic, whatever it might have you. And so then from there we go, whew, problem solved, right? Like we did it. And so when we do things like that, we have to recognize that diversity is more than just faces on a brochure. It's about observable consequences, yes. We should actually see culturally diverse individuals in our field, in our environment. We know that inclusion is important, but it also is about the private events, the MOs. These MOs are what can help us push the needle forward. It can take us from inclusion to equity. They allow for us to confront really hard topics and really hard structural issues and other related topics such as tokenism, microaggressions, micro-insults, and things of that nature. And so seeing meaningful changes of diversity within behavior analysis is going to require a little bit more work from us. And what I believe it's going to require is a personal identification of diversity as a value and an awareness of self as part of an environment that shapes contingencies of inequity. Lastly, it's going to require that analysts consider their own overt and covert behaviors that move our field further or closer to equity. Okay. So B.F. Skinner is known to many of us as the father of behavior analysis, and he talked about social justice to me in a manner of easing human suffering or improving the human condition. And as an analyst, that part of our history is one that I deeply relate to. I think, how do we use our science to impact the larger world? And for me, that means by fighting for justice and equity. So what you see in front of you, this is a quote. It says, "It is our duty to fight for our freedom." That is an Angela Davis quote, something that we chant very often in the social justice spaces. And so when I think about social justice, I think of it to be equitable redistribution of resources. And so I say redistribution because at this point we're playing catch up. We know that the resources are not distributed equally. So now we have to play that catch up and redo things differently. But this also comes down to education, housing, wealth, opportunities of advancement, whether professionally or personally. I also consider it to be, here we go, the elimination of prejudice and social power differences found within these levels that are in front of you. And so we can eliminate oppression within the language that we use. That's the personal level, right? We can eliminate oppression in what we dictate as right or as the norm for beauty. We can eliminate oppression within our policy and procedures, our structures that are related to public policy, legal systems, and variables that maintain a social hierarchy based on our social status. And so we know that oppression exists at a macro level, right? And so a lot of times when we think about it, we say, there's not much we can do because this is just such a big issue. But when we recognize that it exists as a macro level, we also can recognize that we're part of that macro level. We are part of the system. Each one of us have a learning history that encompasses some type of prejudicial messaging of targeted or marginalized groups. And it also means that at some point, depending on your social classification, which might allow for you to hold social power, you've benefited from structural oppression. And so recognizing that we don't exist outside of the world, even though we're scientists and we boast ourselves on being objective, that does not mean that we have not been impacted by structural oppression and the messages and verbal behavior that come along with it. So we can take notice and recognize how exactly we've been impacted. And that's a personal way that we've been impacted. And we can also be honest with its presence in our fields because it has made our way in the field. The outside world is inside of our island. And so the first thing is being honest with that, with the structural differences that encompass behavior analysis. So let me see. So I'm going to give you a few examples of how the outside world shows up in our field. And so what we know, the data, what it shows us is the higher the position of leadership you are, the less representation that we have of women leaders. If you keep going, the numbers are even lower when you take race into consideration. That is also the same. It's very similar in our field. And so this graph that you have, you see that the numbers decrease for certain levels of leadership and recognition. And one of the limitations to our own studies in behavior analysis and why it's important for us to recognize who we are in terms of other people is that we haven't been able to take in certain variables like race. This specific study that's in front of you, they didn't look at race or the non-binary factor. And so it's men, women. Also, the limitation of this study is that they utilized conventional ways of identifying gender. So if your name sounded like you were a woman, we put you in the woman category. Your name sounded like you were a male, we put you in the male category. And so I know that we can do better when we start to think about the ways in which we research cultural variables. Another way that the outside world is coming into our field, we know that racial and ethnic minorities receive lower quality and a lower intensity of healthcare services than white patients, even when they're insured at the same levels and present with the same type of health problems. Also the same thing in our field. There are diagnostic and treatment differences for African-American and Latinx children. They experience a delay between diagnosis and treatment, and then also receive fewer ASD treatment services. Outside world, children from families with lower socioeconomic statuses, which are defined as having income below 200% of the federal poverty line, they have worse access to care than children in higher income families. Same thing in our field, very similar, right? Children from families with lower socioeconomic status receive fewer hours of ASD treatment services, which once again, it's just recognizing as much as we say, we're doing these great things. And I love to bolster our field and, you know, we are trying to do great work, but we are not very much different from the trends that we are seeing in the larger environment. Okay, some other ways that oppression comes up, and I hope we can consider even more than what's on the screen right now. We hear things from certain organizations. People say, we don't accept Medicaid. We do not service that area. The neighborhood is unsafe. Parents must pay for their therapy materials. Parents must have a separate room for autism treatment in their home. We do not offer a sliding scale. A few other things that I don't have written, for example, we can look at who gets promoted, who are our bottom tier workers, and then who gets invited into leadership, who has access to mentoring from upper management, who has access to mentors from people that look like them in upper management, right? If we have different levels of leadership, you're probably gonna have different levels of recognizing people who also have some type of similarities to you. And so why does all this matter? Besides just being unjust, right? It matters because it's our duty. We have some type of duty as analysts to adhere to our ethical code, number one. And there are a few different, and I won't say so many, but there are a few different areas that list culture as a necessary factor to consider. So 1.05 talks about obtaining supervision and consultation and training. So we're doing that right now. We're here. But as analysts, we need to recognize that we also have some limitations in our field related to this. And we're going to need to reach out to other fields who have done the work well before us, psychotherapy fields, sociologists, other social justice organizations, right? 2.0 says, behavior analysts have a responsibility to operate in the best interest of our clients. Well, evidence exists in other related psychology fields that culturally modified interventions are best to meet the needs of diverse populations. We're not that far just yet. We don't know if we have any differences related to cultural interventions for behavior analysis. We haven't studied it yet. But the preponderance of evidence shows that culturally adapted interventions are best to benefit our intervention outcomes. And so let's see, 4.03 also talks about behavior analysts will need to tailor their interventions. One thing that comes up for me are functional assessment. How are we doing our data collection? What are our strategies? Do they differ? Our interview forms, do we ask different questions? Do we explore cultural preferences and norms when we meet different families? And we can consider how the intersection of culture, linguistics, come up in terms of the concepts of behavior analysis in our science. When we are disseminating behavior analysis, how are we speaking to our clients? Are we speaking in a way that they understand? Are we even assessing that there might be differences in the way that we speak from the way that they might understand? And so it is possible that without information about our cultural preferences and norms, that behavior analysts may unintentionally provide less than optimal care if we are leaving out that factor. And lastly, 5.06, behavior analysts design feedback and reinforcement systems in a way that improves supervisee performance. One thing to consider is that there might also be cultural differences to think about in the way that we provide feedback or design systems of reinforcement. All right. So we also have the ethical responsibility to recognize culture, but then you take a look inside of our task list and there's nothing that reflects that. Diversity, equity, competence, nothing listed in our task list. So we have this value. We have this value that's listed in our ethical code, but no training or committed action that could actually lead us there. So does that then tell us something about our field when we say that we care about something and we think that's enough to change it? As behavior scientists, we know better than that. We absolutely do. So we need to consider why there is a disconnect from what we say we value and what we actually do. We would never write a behavior intervention plan, hand it to the caregiver and say, okay, bye, that's it. We would train to that intervention plan. So we know that there are actual behaviors that are necessary even after we've written something or said we care about something or have a plan for something, right? And so what happens then when we have this value and we don't engage in the behaviors that move us closer? Nothing. Your behavior intervention plan ends up on the floor. You come back to see the client and everything is the same. And I think what happens in our field when we say that we have a value for this thing and we don't make any efforts to move towards that, we make room for disparity and we make room for injustice within our field and also within the world. Okay. So Skinner asked, why are we not saving the world in 1987? And I am asking, how do we save the world if we cannot save our fields? And I'm going a little bit further and saying, how can we save our field if we can't even save ourselves? And so in my opinion, we have no structural change without group level change. And there's no group level change without individual change. So I just created this rule, and we'll talk about rule governed behavior a little later. But for individual behavior change, there needs to be some MOs behind it, right? So we know what motivating operations are. They alter the effectiveness of some stimuli or event to serve as the reinforcer. We know that. So the specific MO that we're going to talk about for the rest of this talk is values. So Hayes et al. Tells us that by stating a value, we can either establish or alter the degree to which our stimuli or consequences function as reinforcers or punishers. A value, simply stated, they are verbal MOs that help us to establish certain behavioral patterns. Values help us to orient or direct us to what behaviors we should be engaging in service of our values. And also, values tell us what not to do. And when we need to do them, values actually also can remind us what we care about. And so, one of the things that I want to make sure to say while we're talking about values is a statement isn't a value unless it functions that way. And so, each moment you can choose to either act in alignment to your value or not. And I'll talk about it a little later, how sometimes we might state a value and we might need to consider direct contingencies that kind of go hand in hand with us creating certain values. But I'll move on and talk about why individual values are necessary. Whether we realize it or not, we're always choosing what we care about. You decided to get up early on a Saturday morning because this is something that you care about in some type of way, right? There might be some value in place for you. And so in our fields, we interact with various stakeholders and engage in a plethora of tasks daily. And while doing so, our values are likely showing up with us. So on the screen, there are a few contexts in which values might show up with us in our work. And so client contact, supervision, higher education learning, research, field policy and standards, dissemination to the larger public. Your values are probably showing up with who you work with, who you supervise, what type of supervision that you give, what are you studying in school, right? And so just recognizing that we're choosing the things that we care about as we're kind of, going through or matriculating through life. In the larger world, our values are showing up when we determine what communities we rally behind, whose causes that we show up for or stand up for, whose causes do we ignore? Also, whose voices do we listen to? And it can show up in what companies we decide to patronize. Okay, so what is ACT? ACT is a behavior analytic approach to foster flexible and adaptive responding in the presence of aversive private events, and it aims to increase engagement and values-directed behavior. I think this is one technology that we can actually use to actualize equity and justice. I've used the words values and committed action this morning. Both processes come from this behavior analytic approach to increase flexible and adaptive responding in the presence of aversive private events. So ACT uses processes to increase sensitivity to current environmental contingencies, decrease verbal control, and expose ourselves to aversive private events without resistance, more or less. The purpose then is to increase value-directed action. And so addressing culture, disparity, oppression, it's not easy. I don't care who you are. And if anyone tells you it is easy, I might have them think twice. But it's very hard. And for a lot of us, it's aversive. And it might have some pain associated with it. And there might be really hard moments to deal with as it requires for us to look at old rules and stories that we have been told about certain groups, and oftentimes even ourselves. We might be tasked to recognize that privilege and biases and blind spots are present. We might get called out or called in by those that we aim to service, or we might be asked to sit down or to give up reinforcers that have been provided due to our privilege. And that hard stuff might require us to sit with thoughts of guilt, shame, confusion, anger. So the ACT model can be really useful in engaging in these uneasy moments that move us closer to our value of equity. ACT can allow for us to influence behavior change beyond simply educating people about other cultures. I can lecture to you about competency all day. I can lecture to you about cultural differences, teach you about cultural behaviors, etc. But that alone still might not be enough for you to change anything. And it might not be enough for other individuals to change in their daily lives and their behaviors. And when I think about cultural competence And I'm so grateful to the work that psychotherapists have done related to cultural competence. But when I think about that, I consider limitations such as restricted behavioral responding, possibly overgeneralization of stereotypes. And this could likely create more rigid rules for us to abide by and decrease flexibility when we meet people from a specific group that fall outside of the pre-established rules or information that you learned about that specific group. So if we teach ourselves to be culturally competent, who is this in relation to? If we were to move forward with teaching cultural competence as client-driven fields, we're likely becoming culturally competent for our clients. But considering equity and access issues in the field, and we also consider that structural oppression shows up in the field, we might then start to think about, who are we missing? People with less access to our services. So they're not our clients yet, right? People without healthcare, people in rural areas, people that are in unsafe neighborhoods, people who cannot pay our large out-of-pocket fees. So how are we treating people that can't potentially utilize our services and they're not part of the ABA world? So this is why I think cultural competence, even though it's been great for our information gathering, we need to go a little bit further because we're missing people. When we are solely focused on just our clients, we have a duty to the larger world. And so we know that people of color are less likely to utilize behavioral health services. And so we can start to think about, why is that? And how do we as individuals contribute to the real fears that groups of people hold with accessing our care? And how do we get more people not only using our services, but advancing diversity and equity within our professional sphere? And how are we able to show up for the people who come into our sphere? Do they have to assimilate to our culture, or can they show up as who they are? With ACT, I think it allows us to dig a little bit deeper in addressing some of these issues. So ethically, we're all tasked with being culturally aware and competent. The board states we should recognize our own personal problems and conflicts as they interfere with our effectiveness. This also extends to our personal learning histories. That includes our biases, our prejudices, and even our privileges, because we're taking our learning history with us. And we can try, but no matter what, we can't avoid bringing them with us to our work, with our clients, our interaction with our coworkers, research ideas, who we decide we study for research, our policy and decision making. Our learning history is present before we even speak or meet with the client. So acknowledgement of these histories might allow for us to move forward towards equity and justice for all humans. Okay. So before we get started, I've talked a lot. I told you that I would talk a lot today. But we're going to shift into the part of this presentation where I'm going to need some feedback or just ask for you to do your own work behind the scenes. And so before we get started, I would like for you to name a value that is important to you. And I would like for that to be a value that relates to diversity and equity in some type of way. So you can just write that down. You can take a moment to consider why you joined this webinar this morning. And I want to make sure to say that value is something that I can't give to you. I can tell you what my values are, but this is something personal. So if you could think about what matters to you in the bigger picture, who do you want to be? What do you want to stand for? Who do you want to? And also while you're doing that, if you could take a moment to also consider what's getting in your way of moving closer to that value. Okay, so a value for me is veracity. And what this means is telling the truth, no matter what the naysayers have to say or who hates it. And to go a little further for what that means for me, I try to make sure to utilize a historical context and stay in alignment with that. And so a lot of times I recognize that taking a structural and historical approach might be really difficult for some folks. And it might be easy to shift away from the truth given that. And so for me, what gets in the way is fear of consequences that are reminiscent to the already existing oppression that I face as a woman of color, either day to day or that I faced, in my learning history. And so I'm going to ask, is anyone willing to write their value inside of the chat box? Humility, authenticity. Awesome. Integrity. Okay. And so with our values, transparency, with our values, they could be very powerful they could be very powerful motivators for human beings. And it's important to recognize that just because we say something is a value, it doesn't mean that it's not void of pain or aversive thoughts or consequences. There are two sides of this coin. And so sometimes we might choose a value. So for example, I said that I value veracity, but on the other side of that coin is fear. So we have somewhat of an understanding of values. I wish I could go, into detail, but we're only here for an hour. So I'm going to move forward to acceptance, okay? Acceptance involves willingly exposing ourselves to aversive private stimuli instead of avoiding them. We then can create a context for behavioral variability and new learning in which new behaviors can emerge. Acceptance in layperson terminology or language just might mean making space for or allowing difficult thoughts and feelings to be present, getting curious about our experiences instead of avoiding them. And so I'm going to ask you all a question, and you can please type it in the chat box. If I ask you to sit still right now, and I said, this person, the stranger, is going to come up to you, you don't know them, they're going to hit you, and they're going to hit you really hard. They're going to spit on you. They're going to badly bruise you. Are any of you okay with this? Are you still willing to sit there and participate in the exercise that I just asked you to do? You can just type yes, no, maybe in the chat box. No, no. Am I at work? Nope. No, probably not. All righty. Dr. Pavone, you got to my next part. So what if that same person asks you to sit calmly as a necessary component of a behavior intervention plan for the purpose of helping a child diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder or some form of social, emotional, behavioral learning concerns? And they're asking you to sit calmly as a way to help that person learn how to communicate their needs effectively. Are you now willing to consider sitting there calmly? You can type yes, no, maybe so in the chat box. Of course. Yes. Yes. Okay. Yes. So this process speaks to acceptance. You're now willing to experience it versus avoiding it. Why? Because it's in alignment with something that you value, something that you care about. So in this moment, I'm going to ask for you to use the same variability that you just had here in your behavior. You just named your value in relation to diversity and equity. And instead of avoiding your feelings, you allow yourself to experience something uncomfortable, and you sit with those thoughts and the feelings that you have with that. So if you can all take a piece of paper, you can journal this. I want you to think about a time that you were complicit. And what I mean by complicit is that maybe you reinforce majority messaging in actions that maintain oppression. Did it involve you saying nothing when someone else acted in alignment with the oppression? Maybe you saw a coworker being talked over during a meeting and you stayed silent. Did it involve you doing something? Maybe you made an excuse for someone who made a racist, sexist, transphobic, or homophobic joke. Write it down for yourself. You don't have to write this down in the box. This is a personal activity. And so I would like for you to do that. And while you're writing, I want you to also consider, what was the consequence of engaging in that behavior? Did you access something? Did you avoid something? I'm just going to read this comment into the webinar while you all are writing. So I won't say the name, sorry. I think if we look at everyone as having their own deficits or problems they are working to overcome, and so without judgment, we understand forms of maladaptive behavior as an attempt of communication, and we can dig deeper into the why. There are parts of this that resonate with me. I think the most important part is like having empathy for people who have their own things that they're going through, but also going back to what's the function and recognizing that there are functions behind our behavior. I try to do that. Try, not perfect. Okay, and so if anyone is comfortable, I don't know if you all are done with this. Is anyone comfortable just talking about how this felt for you? So just write out something that you did that maintained oppression in this environment. How did it feel to write that out? Anything that came up for you, if anything? Or you can just say, that was really weird and I got nothing out of it. You can write it in the box. Disappointing. Mm-hmm. Yeah, for me to have to think about complicity towards other groups, a lot of things come up for me: guilt, shame. Someone else said it made me disappointed in myself. There's certainly guilt and immediate attempt to justify it with excuses, frustration, and shame. Yeah. In the context of justice, defensiveness might arise when we context uncomfortable realities about ourselves as well. Darn, I'm not perfect. Yikes. And so I might try to defend. And then I'm going to work to avoid those feelings of uncertainty, those feelings of guilt, shame, sorrow, frustration, incompetence. It doesn't feel great. But if I identified something as a value, I'm now able to label avoidance as unworkable, or avoidance or avoidant behaviors as unworkable. And so I can't hide from it. As individuals and as a group, we would need to be willing to expose ourselves to this kind of private stimuli, to take or modify action, even when it's uncomfortable. Avoiding confusing conversations and private thoughts associated with these topics can't function as a reinforcer. But even if we avoid the process, there are other people still in our environment and they're impacted by our behaviors. So creating change often means being uncomfortable. And if change is of value to us, are we willing to experience that? Just like we were willing to experience someone hitting us so that they can communicate more effectively in the future. So present moment awareness. This just really means that everyone else is here, but we're somewhere in the past, somewhere in the future. Present moment awareness has a mindfulness component. And so a way to think about it is that it's just, we can notice. So I think present moment awareness gives us that usefulness by just noticing when uneasy topics come up and where our attention goes. It's useful being aware when we've entered into conversations or environments with privileged identities, our privileged learning history, our identities that are related to privilege from our learning histories, and recognizing who we are in relation to other people and their social identity and status. Also recognizing when those rules are popping up in your head. And so one of the things that come up, we all have learned information about individuals. And, I know that when certain people see me, a Black woman who has on large hoop earrings and a shirt that says Black Girl Magic, there might be some frames that are popping into their head. Oh goodness, here we go. Who is this person? Does she know what she's talking about? That's another way that we can be mindful. When those things come in our head about other groups of people, noticing those, allowing ourselves to literally just be present with that thought in the moment as it comes. And so also, I want us to consider mindfulness for what happens when people call us out on our behavior, or they give us critical feedback for uplifting the status quo. I work in the social justice arena. And sometimes, even if you're an accomplice, an activist, a change agent, an ally, or a good person, whatever you might call yourselves, you do things that are inappropriate, hurtful to other people. And so mindfulness, present moment awareness can be useful in those instances. So I would like for you to take some time again. I want you to think about a time that you enacted a microaggression, which means you admitted an offensive act related to someone's social identity. This could be at work. Maybe you made a joke about someone's cultural garb. This could be with a client. Maybe you made an assumption or a generalization based on someone's culture, or maybe just in everyday life. If you can't immediately recall one, maybe you can recall a private event, something you said in your mind, or something that you wish you could have said out loud, but you knew it wasn't politically correct. So you considered that it would be offensive to the listener, but it was still there. I would like for you to think about that. And you don't have to write it in the box. This is for yourselves. Okay. So I want you to now take a moment to consider your listener. Consider that deep offense was taken to what you did or what you said. What might this person say to you? How might they look at you? Think about what their private events might be that are consequential to your behavior. And so for this purpose, I would like for you to take a moment to close your eyes. I would like for you to visualize that person, or maybe those group of people in front of you. I want you to say these words that you wrote down to yourself. Visualize this person's face. Visualize their response or their responses to you. And when you start to see this, when you see them in front of you, when you see their response to you, I want you to stay with this moment. Notice the response of your body. Notice the clenching of your chest cavity. Notice your heart racing. Any feelings of anxiousness or other activity that you're having within your body. So present moment awareness is telling us to stay here right now, stay here in the world, remaining present. We then now have this special power that we can tap into, which is choice. Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that power of choice in a moment. But before I move to the next principle, I want us to talk very briefly about rule-governed behavior, because I've mentioned rules a few times. Rule-governed behavior is specified by a rule itself. So it's verbal behavior. It's not necessarily a direct contingency. So in this meme, for example, you have this woman saying, hey, I know our email addresses are supposed to be our first initial plus our last name, but could you make an exception? And the person, and the person says, no, that Brenda Uthead is quite a whiner. Okay, so here you have this man adhering to the rule, no matter the context or new information in the current environment that might indicate a need for flexibility. And so we probably can think of instances of rule-governed behavior. I'll give you an example. One time I was doing a social justice event, and it was in Philadelphia. I arrived with my group, and we had like a heap load of items, things that we wanted to give, pamphlets that we wanted to give away, things like that. And so when we arrived to the entrance, there was a woman there, and she created this rule. She said no large transportation items could fit into the entryway. But the entryway was actually a gate. So if it was a gate, that means it opens and it closes, it expands and it, pulls closer, whatever. And so it didn't matter. She had this rule, and she made us take every item of the cart down one by one to fit inside of the little space that she had already created on the gate. And so it was very interesting just to see rule governed behavior play out in that moment. Like even when being told like, hey, this expands, look, she was like, no, it's the rule. And so sometimes with our rules, our behavior is just in relation to that rule. And then we become insensitive to the changes in our environment that might tell us different. So even though in fact that entrance was big enough, she adhered to that rule despite it. So other examples of rule governed behavior: touch a stove, touch a hot stove, you'll get burned. Play with fire, you get burned. Speed, you'll get a ticket. Come into contact with a police officer, do everything they tell you to do. See a Black person, cross the street, protect your items. See a person of color, follow them so they don't steal. Women, they stay at home with the children. Poor people, they mooch off welfare. These are rules that we've been told, and these are rules that some of us adhere to. I won't spend too much time on this, but I think it's important if we're talking about all this that I have to bring up RFT. And so I'm going to at least cover it very general before we move on. And I want to encourage you to continue learning about this on your own. But essentially, RFT reminds us that language is arbitrary until we give it meaning. And so in this example here that I have on the PowerPoint, I have taught you that poor people have no money, and they have no money to access our treatment services, okay? So with that, I've also taught you that low-income clients have no money to access our treatment services. Because of this, with this, there comes an indirect learning that takes place, or a derived relation, and you're not able to combine what you've been taught about this poor person with lower income clients. So low income clients now become related to poor people. Lower income clients are now poor people. So what happens with this? All this information that we have in our network about poor people, so let's say with poor people, we avoid them, they're lazy, they're hard to deal with, they won't try, they complain a lot. That information is transformed, what we call transformation of stimulus function, and it's put into your networks. So now you might draw the same relations based on combinatorial entailment. And so what you think about poor people is now what you think about lower income clients, and that's popping up immediately. So I hope that was a general understanding. I'm gonna move on. I'm gonna bring up some RFT stuff really quickly, but not in detail. Alrighty. So the next principle of ACT, diffusion. Diffusion allows us to respond to words flexibly. It allows us to notice function and loosen verbal control. And so I talked about transformation of stimulus function. This means in this context that words no longer have to function the same way. We can observe our thoughts just as thoughts and observe them as stimuli that we can respond to in a variety of ways. So not just one rigid way. So let's say a rule is that men deserve more money for their work. When we're fused with this rule, there becomes some rigid rule following, which is why we talked about rule governed behavior. So this rigid rule following just means your behavior is under strict verbal control, and you're responding to words as if they're literal or real or true, regardless of what information has been given to you in the contrary. So it restricts behavioral variability, and it limits our repertoire of responding. So now we're responding to all those words very rigidly. I want you to take another moment to consider a rule. Consider a stereotype that you learned about another group of people. And I want you to consider one that you no longer hold, okay? Something that you recognize that you were taught in the past, but now you know that it's not true. And so while you're doing that, I'm gonna give you an example that came up in the larger media a little while ago. There was a comedian, she learned a stereotype about Muslim people or people who wore turbans. And what she learned was that Muslims and people who wear turbans are terrorists and they bomb planes. And so what this comedian did is she got on a plane and she saw a group of Sikh men. There was a derived relation happening here. Sikh men to her equal Muslim men. Sikh men equal people with turban, they bomb planes. So she saw these men who have formal similarity to the stereotype or the rules that she had been taught. And what did she do? She responded in the same way that she would had this been a group of Muslim men that got on the plane. And so she saw them and she said to herself, they're going to kill us. They're going to bomb our plane. And so she went and she said, I'm going to go get security and tell them that there's a threat here. And just so you know what's going on with me for now, I just got choked up, and I'm going to allow myself to be mindful and present in that moment. Is, you know, it's disturbing. You can imagine being someone in that situation and you're just trying to travel and someone, you know, evokes that you are a threat to them. And so this person actually got up and went to security and she said, there's a threat here. So she was so fused with this rule. And this is what happens when we're inflexible to the terrible things that we've been taught about other groups of people. So now her behavior was shifted and people's lives were impacted based on this rule that she derived immediately. And so diffusion tells us that we don't have to respond in the same way. And that's one thing that we can learn from RFT, is that we're not going to get rid of this thought. You know, no one's blaming you for having a thought, because RFT tells us that at any moment you can derive that relation. And so in these talks, I normally do an example and I'll have us retrieve information from the frames that we've learned about other groups of people, but we don't have time for that today. But with that example that I give, people see that no matter where they are in their journey, does not matter how great of an activist you are, no matter how great of a person you think you are able to retrieve that information without even thinking about it, without effort. And so with diffusion, we can recognize that. We can recognize that and still allow for more information and frames to be put inside of our network. And so another way to describe this in layman's terms might be to consider it as our memory bank. So we can put more information inside of our brain, our memory bank. So let's say now I have all this information inside my memory bank and I value equity and I value justice. So this private event happens. I see a group of Muslim men or I see a group of Sikh men and I still think I have a moment where I'm nervous. I feel a tightness in my chest. So I feel bad because now I have this value. And so I think, why do I still think like this? And one thing that we can do is accept that this thought doesn't feel good to you, right? It's there. You notice your body sensations, you notice the tight jaw, your stomach dropping, tightness in your chest, and then you choose to enact a different behavioral response. So diffusion is going to allow for us to just look at those thoughts, observe, and then choose how to respond to them versus reacting to them or from some place in the past that's given us our next moment or our next level of action. So yeah, we can do something new. We can respond in a different way. We can observe, take a moment, consider them, notice the functions of them, and then we can let them go. So now instead of recycling an old rule, I'm responding to, you know, I just had to do it. I just felt unsafe. I deserve to, whatever it might be, we can do something different. Alrighty, so I want to talk about self as context versus self as content. So this is just awareness of ourselves as a context of our experience versus the content of our experience. And this tells us that we are able to observe our experience. So an example might be, I am an ally. I am a good person. I am not racist. I am not sexist. I'm a behavioral analyst. Self as content, this is the rules about ourselves. And so we respond to the stories about ourselves very rigidly. This is the rule governing behavior coming back in. And it's meaning that we're insensitive to changes in our environmental and we're insensitive to environmental contingencies or what the world or people in front of us are telling us. And so we continue to respond as if we are our experiences as opposed to being the context to our experiences. And so self as context allows us to have flexible perspective taking, a willingness to take perspective of other people, allow us to have that empathy and considering the experiences of other people when they tell us information. So I'm a good person, but sometimes I also am ... I am not a racist, but sometimes I do ... I am a behavior analyst, but sometimes I'm not objective. And so flexibility in knowing that two things can't exist at one time. This is context, right? And so when we are so fused with self as content, like I'm a good person, then we might become unaware of people who feel excluded by the frames, stories, and the rules that we've created. We might ignore their suffering because it's different from ours, or because we have different learning histories, and it's just different from what we know for ourselves to be true. And so I also think about accomplice behavior. So like, how do I engage in behavior change for the greater benefit of specific marginalized groups? And so one example that comes up for me is the LGBTQ population. So sometimes in this population or within the community, you hear the word partner used to describe partner. And so let's say that I, as someone who values equity, have been asked to replace the term boyfriend with partner to help folks in the LGBTQ population community to not feel singled out or be outed in a larger environment. If I adhere to this rule that I'm a straight person, so I don't use the term partner, I use boyfriend, what happens for me? I continue with my behavioral responding. So each time someone says, who is that? I say, this is my boyfriend. So yeah, same behavioral pattern is happening. But then what happens to my family, my LGBTQ family, who's asked for me to show up for them? Now I'm part of the context or the environment that makes it oppressive for other people. So I'm not gay, but I can also use the word partner. This allows flexibility, especially when people from marginalized groups are telling us how they need us to show up for them, or they're telling us how they wish for us to behave or engage in their fight for equity or humanity. So you're not the ways that you describe yourself to be. You're not the stories you tell yourself. You're still there. You're a full human being, a full human experience. You do some good things. You do some not so good things. So that says to yourselves, you are the context, not the content, and accepting that you can't always put yourself in other people's shoes, but you can make room for their unique experiences. Alrighty, we have a few minutes, 2 minutes. And so I want to go to something that you all can do on your own. But once we identify what we care about, we must determine what actions will move us closer to what we value and what actions are unhelpful and move us away. So value statements, they tell us what we care about, but they do not tell us what we need to do or what our goals are. So looking around, our anecdotal experience tells us that we as a field, we've not yet figured out how to address diversity and equity, right? We have the value, we don't have the committed action towards it. And so that's where this process for ACT comes in, committed action. This is the development of patterns or of effective action that are linked to our values. And so when we say we value something, it doesn't necessarily mean our behaviors are going to immediately align with that value. The rules that we tell ourselves might be impacting our behavior more than the value itself. So for example, with this value, if I'm in alignment with this value, then this is going to prove that I'm a good person. Or if I tell people that I value equity, I might be met with social praise or maybe even speaking engagements like this one. And then I get to tell people how to be a good person like Denisha, like, hi, you all, be more like me, right? That's considering direct contingencies and rule governed behavior also. So maybe I'm actually following this rule, right, that I have versus the value. So it's important that we don't just stop at choosing a value. We can't just stop there. We need effective movement towards a more equitable and diverse world and field of applied behavior analysis. And so that's going to include many small, individual, and large-scale actions by all of us. And so what I would like for you to do is to take a moment to consider your committed actions. You can think about what you're going to do today, this week, this month. I would like for you might have chosen more, but just take one example and then write down 3 goals for that value. And I know that we don't have time to do that. So what I'm going to say is when you do that on your own, now it's time to do the work. You have to set the measurable goals. You have to track and assess to see if that value is actually functioning the way that you want them to. Tracking says, yeah, I stated this as a value. I have this value here, but is my behavior actually aligned with it? And if it's not, then we might need to reassess if this is actually a value, or we might need to assess what's getting in the way of contact and reinforcement. So we as analysts, we hold an individual responsibility to getting us to where we need to be. When we place the responsibility outside of ourselves, it keeps us in the same place, both individually and as our field and in the world. So we need to look beyond the words and assess and track our behavior. And what really matters is what works. So with that said, thank you all for listening. We'll open it up to, I don't know if we have time for questions or not, but thank you.
Thank you so much. I learned a lot.
No problem. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much for this. This was amazing. Guys, if you have questions, please, you could please use your microphone, the chat box as well. You might as well ask questions here. If you want to have a more private conversation, I can also share Denisha's email as well, which is A-OK. Let's see if anyone wants to pose a question. Oh, thank you for sharing the references.
Actually, I don't think yeah, something's off in there, but you can see.
Yeah. I'll actually take a screenshot of this.
Yeah, go ahead. I just saw a typo. I'm like, whoops.
I'll do that. And I'll also send that to the attendees. All right, well, if no one has a question they want to pose at this moment, walking away from this presentation, we'll have to think about and put into practice moving forward. Awesome. I'm so glad that's the case. Yeah, that's the purpose of these sorts of presentations. And clearly Denisha did that for us today. So thank you so much. Yeah, so I will be sending out to everyone an email with the screenshots and also with the recording link in case you want to review this at a later time. You are more than welcome to do so. And I will also be sending out a Google survey with a few different questions so that you're able to fill out and then be able to obtain your CEU certificate. Two. Oh yeah, Denisha, you know that you are more than welcome to come at any time.
I appreciate that.
Of course, clearly the DBA membership loves you, so this is good. All right, so I guess we'll plan a part 2 in our emails.
Perfect.
Awesome. And everyone, I hope you all have a great rest of your Saturday and weekend. And the next Coffee and CEU event should occur sometime in mid-April. So until then, take care, and I'll speak to you via social media and emails. Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.